Hey everyone, my name is Zach, and this is the pokemonrng.com video guide for how to get Wishmaker Jirachi on emulator without Dolphin. So we actually have a guide currently for how to connect Dolphin to VBA, but this has several problems. First, the link is unstable and does not work 100% of the time. You also need several tools. You need a different version of VBA than what it takes to run Lewis scripts. This also works with MGBA as well. It needs Dolphin, which can be resource intensive and doesn't work on all computers. Not everyone has the ability to run Dolphin. For VBA, you need a GBA BIOS. MGBA also supports this. I don't know if you need a BIOS for it, but then you have to load up your BIOS into VBA. You've got to specifically say, I want to connect this emulator to the GameCube. You've got to set up the GameCube to have a second port for the GBA. You've got to actually establish the connection. And even then, the connection fails frequently. And our advice is basically just keep trying until you get it. It's a really frustrating process, and it has a lot of connection issues. Even after you connect it, sometimes you still disconnect. It takes a lot of time and effort to try and get this to work, and it's very frustrating. Now, there are lots of games that this can be used for, but a really commonly used one is the Coliseum bonus disc, and this does not actually need Dolphin to work. The Coliseum bonus disc sends a Wishmaker distribution ROM, a Game Boy Advance ROM, to your Game Boy Advance or your emulator, and that ROM is actually what generates the Jirachi and saves it to your game. So you might be thinking, well, can't we just extract the ROM from the Coliseum bonus disc and load it directly into the emulator? And the answer is no. So there are actually 4 problems with that. First, most emulators don't actually support loading this special type of ROM correctly. So if you try to load it in most emulators, you're probably just going to get a black screen, or it might even crash. For the few emulators that actually do load that correctly, the distribution ROM checks to make sure a GameCube is actually present. That's a problem if we just load it directly into an emulator without a GameCube. Second, it makes sure that the cartridge plugged into the console, the Game Boy Advance, is Ruby or Sapphire. And so if we load the distribution ROM into an emulator instead of Ruby or Sapphire, a ROM's not going to be present. A valid ROM is not going to be present, and so it's just not going to load. And then the fourth problem is that it checks to make sure that the chipset used in your cartridge, your Ruby or Sapphire cartridge, is valid. So if we're not even using the Ruby or Sapphire ROM, the emulator's not going to even know, oh, I should emulate a valid chipset. So we have 4 problems with that. And I made some patches to the multi-boot ROM to fix those problems. It makes sure that it thinks a Ruby or Sapphire cartridge is loaded into the Game Boy Advance, that it has a valid chipset, it doesn't care if a GameCube is present, and for most emulators that don't load the special distribution ROM correctly, it fixes that bug. So in order to download the patches to get this to work, click on this version 2.0.0 link and click on this patches.zip file to download it. Here's my desktop. Here, I've got my downloads folder, which has the patches.zip file that I just downloaded from GitHub. I've got a games folder, which has my ruby.gba file, as well as my Ruby save file. And then I have this Wishmaker folder with a client.bin. So this is the Wishmaker distribution ROM, the Game Boy Advance ROM, extracted from the Coliseum bonus disc. I'm not going to get into how to extract that from the GameCube bonus disc, but it's definitely a Googleable question. This is something that isn't very difficult to get. Don't ask me for it. I am not going to give you it, but it is something that you can get. Let's try loading the client.bin file into the Game Boy Advance emulator so you can actually see what it does. Now, MGBA is one of the emulators that loads these type of multi-boot files correctly. So unlike other emulators, it is actually going to try to load. It's not just going to be a black screen. And you can see we have some of the graphics from the Wishmaker distribution ROM, but it just kind of stops here. And that's because of those other checks that I mentioned. It's currently checking to make sure that a GameCube actually is connected, which it's not because we're not using Dolphin. So let's fix these problems. I'm going to shut down the emulator. Let's go to the downloads folder here. In the downloads, I have that patches.zip file I downloaded previously. If we unzip it, we're going to get this patches folder. And if we go in there, there's going to be 2 other folders, one for MGBA, one for any other emulator. So remember how I said that most emulators don't actually load these distribution ROMs from GameCubes correctly? These patches, in addition to fixing the other issues, also fix the bug in most emulators so that they will load this correctly. If you're using MGBA, you need to use the MGBA specific patches. So in order to apply this patch, we need an IPS patcher. And there's a great website that I'll link in the description that does this in the web browser, so you don't need to download any extra programs or tools. For the ROM file, select your client.bin, your Wishmaker distribution ROM, the Game Boy Advance one. For the patch file, select the client.ips file for your type of emulator, MGBA or any other emulator. After that, click Apply Patch, and it'll download the patched client.bin file. All right, so if we go back to my files, you'll see that I now in my downloads folder have this client patched bin file. This is the fixed Wishmaker file. So I'm going to pull that out of my downloads folder, and I'm going to rename it to be Wishmaker Fixed, just so it's easier to keep track of. So let's actually try loading this in MGBA now and see what happens. And you'll notice that it actually loads this time. There was text showing that it was trying to load, it was trying to send the Jirachi to the game, but now it's giving us an error saying there's no save file. Cool, so the patch actually works. We can now use this without Dolphin. We just need to make the distribution ROM see the save file. I'm going to shut this down. So MGBA has an option in the menu to load a save file from some other place in your computer. But I'm going to show you how I get around this for all emulators, not just MGBA, because you're not always going to have that option. So first, this Wishmaker Fix save file, if this exists, delete it. That's just a blank, that's just a meaningless save file. Take your Ruby save file, rename it to wishmakerfixed.save. And then move it to be next to your Wishmaker Fix.bin file. So now this is the Ruby save. When we load the Wishmaker distribution ROM, the emulator is also going to load our Ruby save file. So now if I load the Wishmaker distribution ROM, you'll see that it's actually working now. It's actually sending the Jirachi to the ROM, no errors anymore. And you can see it's also trying to update the berry program, but I don't need the update. This animation with the Pokeball spinning is going to take a while. It'll feel like it takes forever, just bear with it. When you're using an actual GameCube, you're going to see the Wishmaker Jirachi spinning on the TV screen, and then after a while, it whooshes into your Game Boy Advance. And that's what would normally be happening right now. So they have this Pokeball spinning as a way to just show like, oh, progress is happening while you get to watch some movie on your TV. But in just a moment, we'll see there. The Jirachi has whooshed into our save. All right. So now I'm going to stop the emulation. I'm going to rename the Wishmaker Fixed save file back to ruby.save and move it to be next to my Ruby Game Boy Advance file. Let's load Ruby and see what happens. And I'll speed up the emulator so that we can get through all this faster. Now, if I look at my party, there it is. The Wishmaker Jirachi is in the save file. And there you have it. That's how you can get Wishmaker Jirachi without Dolphin on lots of emulators, including some web and mobile emulators. Hopefully this makes this really cool event Pokemon a lot more accessible for other people. If you like what we do, please support us on Discord and pokemonrng.com, as well as subscribe to this channel. That helps fund research, development, and guides. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you next time.